Hello, Jeff Zwarenk here. Welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of the show where we explore important scientific ideas and how they support the truth of Christianity. Today we're joined by Erica Carlson, and we're going to explore what she thinks is the strongest evidence for the truth of the Christian faith. Erica, it's good to have you here today.
It's good to be here.
So kind of give us a little bit of background. Who are you and what do you do science-y?
I am a professor of physics and astronomy at Purdue University.
Someone after my own heart there.
Exactly. And I work on quantum materials, actually. So I work on what electrons do inside of solids and the quantum aspects of that.
Oh, very good. So, I mean, as a Christian who's in a prominent scientific field, I'm sure you're asked, how can you be a Christian and a scientist at the same time? So what do you think is the evidence for Christianity from a scientist? As a scientist, how would you answer that?
All right, so from a scientific point of view, I love it, by the way, when my colleagues ask me that stuff, because I have studied the issue deeply myself, because it was critical to my own faith development to be solid on that. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned has made me so confident in the faith. I love it when colleagues ask that. So if it's one of my colleagues asking, typically the thing that they are most concerned with first would be a timescale issue, because we have really solid data on how old the Earth is and how old the universe is. And there are kind of these ideas rattling around society that maybe the Bible contradicts that. And so that's almost always the first thing that I need to address with a colleague, is the timescale issue. So let me give you a really quick way to address that. I mean, if we look at Genesis 1, that would be the main creation account in the Bible. And I take that very seriously. I have studied that passage in depth. I'm actually trying to teach myself to chant the Hebrew as a Torah reader would chant it, so that I can understand it, as I can understand it more deeply. And so the first thing I would point people to is that the passage has a lot of structure in it, right? So it's an ancient document. It's thousands of years old. So, keep in mind that English has a lot more words available than modern English has a lot more words available than ancient Hebrew. It's almost like they were texting. So think of it along those lines. It's pretty terse as far as what they say. And so we have to respect that when we look at the document. And if you look at the structure, you can get this out of any English translation. Take very seriously the parallelism in the passage, right? So they couldn't do things like bold font or underline. The things that a writer could do that would communicate importance and structure is one of their tools was repetition and putting things in parallel. So the first
give us some examples of where the parallel would show up.
So the first thing I'd point to in Genesis 1 is that the 6 creation days have a structure to them. They all start with the same phrase, and you can get this out of any English translation. They start with the same phrase. Then God said, "Let there be." Stuff, and then the stuff happens, and then there was evening and there was morning, day 1. Then God said, let there be, and then the stuff happens, and then there was evening and there was morning, day 2. Every day is bracketed by the exact same phrase. Then God said, "Let there be," and there was evening and there was morning, day 5. So when you notice that gives you a clue as to when the first day begins. And so if you track very carefully, I encourage people to, don't take my word for this, open it up and check for yourself. If you look very carefully at the first instance in the passage of "Then God said, let there be," that's happening in verse 3. So you got, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth.
The earth was formless, void, darkness on the surface of the deep, Spirit of God hovering over the surface waters. And then God said."
Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So it's not until verse 3 that you actually get day 1 starting, according to that parallelism, which you can see yourself in any English translation. So day 1 begins in verse 3. It's after the initial statement of the beginning of the universe, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, etc. You have the universe already existing in verse 1.
Right.
You have the earth being discussed in verse 2, and it's not until day 3 that the creative days begin. So that means, independent of how you translate that Hebrew word for day is yom, independent of how you translate the Hebrew word yom, you have no timestamp in Genesis 1 on the creation of the universe, or on the creation of the earth. I think that's exceedingly important for people to notice about the passage.
So in some sense, independent of how long the creation week might have been, that doesn't tell us where the universe was born. And so the fact that the scientists will say it's 14 billion years old,
Right.
that's not an inherent contradiction, at least.
Absolutely. It's just not covered.
Okay.
The passage doesn't tell us a timestamp on when God created the universe. It doesn't tell us a timestamp on when God created the earth. After the creation of those things, now we get the beginning of the creative days, the 6 creative days.
So what do you see as you're looking through the rest of the Genesis creation account? Do you find that accords with what we know scientifically, or does that seem to go against what we know scientifically?
So I find that it's remarkably consistent. So I'm a physical scientist, so I'll stick to what it tells you about the physical sciences. And I think if you're patient with a passage, keep in mind you're reading something that's thousands of years old, and you're willing to let the passage speak for itself. I think you find an order of events in there that is remarkably on point. It's remarkably consistent with what we've discovered scientifically in the meantime. And in fact, it's so accurate as to be, in my opinion, it requires a supernatural co-author to get that right.
That's a remarkable statement, and I would have kind of just to help connect that with what's actually in there. What are some of those things that to you stand out as remarkable that this ancient text would get right, given what we know scientifically today?
Okay, so you have the so in day 1 you have then God said, let there be light, and there was light, and it tells you some of the purposes of the light there in that day, and then once the light's in place, you have statements about God separating waters above from waters below. I think probably the first thing to notice. Okay, here's where I see people making let's say a dubious step in interpretation there. When God says, let there be light, he has already told you the point of view from which he's doing the passage. So we already had the statement in verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And, key phrase, the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. So that gives you, if you will, that gives you a camera angle. So I like to have...
That's a radical shift in how a lot of people look at the creation account.
Absolutely. So he's told you the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters, and he's the one telling you the story. So unless there's another statement somewhere else that shifts the perspective, you've got to take that as a perspective, because that's what the passage told you. So I like to have people imagine that God's got kind of like a little buoy there on the water, and it's got like a selfie stick. Okay, he's taking a selfie movie while he's doing this, but the camera's on the surface of the waters, where he is, and that's going to be the perspective of the passage. So when it says, then God said, let there be light, and there was light, I think it's important to notice where he is. Remember your camera angle. Your camera angle's on the surface of the earth. You already know that it starts off with darkness. Okay, that's in verse 2, but where's the darkness? The darkness is over the surface of the deep. That's where the darkness is. There's no statement about the rest. A lot of people imagine a black universe.
And that's remarkable because that's the way the earth starts out from our scientific perspective.
Exactly. But a lot of people read it kind of quickly and they imagine the whole universe being dark. Yeah. But the passage it's wonderfully careful. It's so careful. It's so careful. It's almost like as careful as you can be without actually using mathematics. It kind of blows my mind. So it very carefully says that the darkness is over the surface of the deep. There's just no statement about the rest of the universe. Now you know that the camera angle is on the surface of the earth. Then now you set the stage for when God, basically, it's very simple Hebrew, it's like he says lights, and then the light's happening, And so that's happening within your camera angle. Your camera angle showing darkness. You could probably imagine hearing water because it's talking about the surface of the deep. And then God says, let there be light. Now you can see things, okay? And so it's telling you, it was dark on the surface of the deep. Your camera angle now shows that there's light, but the camera's stuck on the surface of the earth. So this is the time period when the surface of the earth gets some light on it. It's very careful, right? It's very careful to make those fine distinctions.
Well, it's fun to listen to you here because I can tell you're very passionate about this, and I bet you have a lot more about this. And I think there's a resource I can point people to. But I really appreciate what you're saying here is that there is a lot of, when you look carefully at what Genesis says, it really does align with what we know scientifically.
Yeah.
So I thank you a lot for your comments, Erica.
Yeah. My pleasure.
You know, it really is fascinating that when we push into what does Genesis say about the creation, we find that it really does line up scientifically. You know, I would encourage you to go onto YouTube, search for Erica Carlson, and you will get access to some videos where she explores what goes on in Genesis 1 and how it lines up with the scientific account. And that will equip you to be better prepared to share the gospel with the people God brings into your life.